Well, this is the second lesson on the conflict with the Plains Indians in the years 1862 to 1876. The last lesson of Unit 2, and what today's going to focus on is Red Cloud's War. So, I'm not going to talk too much about it at the moment, but what you need to understand is that during this period, remember, there was lots of conflict, reservations had become more difficult to live in, and overall, the government were trying to think of the best possible way of controlling the Native Americans. So again, if we just look at the EdXL scheme of learning, we have got the significance of Red Cloud's War and the Fort Laramie Treaty, the last bullet point at the bottom there. Remember, the exam board can literally examine you on anything on here. And what we tend to notice as teachers is that the wording of these questions, the wording of these of this specification tends to be very similar to what the exam board will use. Okay, they shouldn't throw anything out there that might shock us. I mean, they might throw a few questions out there that might be a bit, oh, that's difficult. But like, for example, last year, we've already looked at the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1851. This Fort Laramie Treaty just says 1868, when in fact it was the second Fort Laramie Treaty. But last year's exam was explain two consequences of the Fort Laramie Treaty, and it put the date next to it. It's not going to make it too obvious. It needs you to understand when the dates are to really develop the answer. And the biggest problem with that question was last year is that most students answered about the first Fort Laramie Treaty because they didn't know much about the second. But the second Fort Laramie Treaty, the one of 1868, is very influential. It's a massive consequence of Red Cloud's War of the years 1866 to 1868. So let's delve a bit more into it. The causes, once again, gold. Gold was another big war, was a big reason why this war was triggered. So gold was discovered in Montana in 1862. Okay, remember this doesn't happen until 1866 to 1868, but the trigger was gold. Now, the fastest way to get to Montana was through Lakota Sioux land using the Bozeman Trail. So there was this trail called the Bozeman Trail, and the best way you could get to Montana was by going through land that they technically weren't allowed to go through. This went against the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1851. So once again, it's another example of where the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1851 was broken. But who do you think the government took in terms of sides? Of course, it's going to be the prospectors, the gold miners, because they give more to the American economy. So by 1865, 2,000 people used the trail, and the Lakota Sioux attacked many of these people, but more kept coming. So there was lots of attacks by the Lakota Sioux on these people, which meant the government needed to get involved. Now, the US government was put under pressure from the Indians to stop the miners, but also under pressure from the miners to stop the attacks by the Indians. So the government were in a bit of a difficult situation. The government were being asked by the Indians to stop the miners because it was part of the Fort Laramie Treaty, but the miners were telling the government to stop the Indians attacking them. So the US government arranged a meeting with Red Cloud to try and discuss this ongoing problem of people being attacked on the Bozeman Trail. However, Red Cloud discovered that the US Army were also building forts along the Bozeman Trail while he was talking to the government, which shows one thing. I'll add this because it doesn't say. The government had no interest in coming to an alternative with Red Cloud. They were always going to take the side of the miners because they gave more overall, according to the government. So Red Cloud thought that the only way to be able to overcome this was to fight the government. Now, bear in mind, in 1864, you had the Sand Creek Massacre, and the rumours of the government, well, not the rumours, the stories, sorry, of the government massacring men, women, and children caused a massive rift between the government and the Native Americans. So the government weren't overly trusted at this stage. So the events and the consequences, this is all in one, and we're going to look at the consequences in a lot of detail shortly. Now, not all of the Lakota Sioux sided with Red Cloud, but most of them did. Other Indians, such as the Cheyenne and the Arapaho, joined him. Red Cloud had 3,000 warriors fighting 700 soldiers. So if anything, the Native Americans had the numbers. They had a lot more warriors fighting US Army. So what needs to be understood here is that the Sioux, Cheyenne, Arapaho were all fighting against the government. Now, why would the Cheyenne and the Arapaho be getting involved? Possibly as a form of revenge against the Sand Creek Massacre. So in December 1866, there was an attack on men who were cutting wood of one of the forts. Now, this needs to be understood. So December 1866, we're in the years of Red Cloud's War. Captain Fetterman was sent with 80 men to protect these men who were cutting wood. Now, the Lakota Sioux had a tactic, and what they did was they sent a couple of Indians out, they got spotted, and they ran away. Okay, so their tactic, send a few Indians out, purposely get spotted, and do a runner. Then they would be chased. And the key thing is that the 2 or 3 Indians that were being chased would run into an area where there were lots more Indians, and then the people that ran after them would be slaughtered. This is what happened to Captain Fetterman and the 80 men. A couple of Sioux Indians ran out, they ran away. Fetterman and his 80 men were then surrounded by hundreds of Indians and slaughtered to death. This was known as Fetterman's Trap because it was the first time it happened on Captain Fetterman. The Lakota Sioux surrounded Fort Kearny and nobody could move along the Bozeman Trail. So when this occurred, the Lakota Sioux basically stopped anyone from travelling on the Bozeman Trail. They had full control over the fort that the government built, and nobody could get across the trail. The government now had a decision to make. Do they just try and work it out with them, or do they fight? And the government actually gave in. A peace commission, so a group of people met, and they actually came to an agreement that the best thing to do would be to make peace talks with the Sioux because of just how threatening they were with this growing army of 3,000 warriors. Red Cloud was successful, and because of the events, the government closed the Bozeman Trail, finding another way to get to the goal. Now, by the time this had all happened, actually another trail had been found, but it's the fact that the Native Americans were successful and the government closed the trail. They said no white settlers were allowed through it. Red Cloud agreed to take his people to a reservation in Dakota, and a second Fort Laramie Treaty agreed that the new reservation was for Sioux only. They were given a great Sioux reservation that was just for them, and this was another success. No non-Indian settlers were allowed to enter this great Sioux reservation. So this was one of the first times where the government had to basically compromise on their ideas. And it was a way, I mean, the Sioux were one of the greatest nations in Native American history. So by giving them what they wanted, they hoped that there would be less conflict as time went on. Some followers refused to sign the Second Fort Laramie Treaty and continued to fight. 2 chiefs called Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse are particularly important, and we'll definitely talk about those in later lessons. So, again, a lot of people might be a bit shocked, thinking, well, this isn't really a war. It is still conflict, okay? And with this one in particular, you can argue that the Native Americans were slightly successful. So, first task. 2 tasks here. What do the following have to do with Red Cloud's War? So what I'd like you to do is to write down the word and then explain what it's got to do with Red Cloud's War. And then, why was Red Cloud able to win his war with the US government? And I want you to explain why these phrases here helped Red Cloud win his war. So this is this key words, key understanding of Red Cloud's War. Okay? I'm not asking you to do a profile on these. I just want you to understand the key things. If you want to do a profile, then you can do a profile, and I'll add this in as an optional. So as an optional task, you can do a profile on Red Cloud's War, include who was involved, why did it happen, what happened, and the consequences. Okay? Pause the video here, spend about 15-20 minutes doing this task, getting your head around Red Cloud's War, and then move on to the next task, looking at the consequences in detail. Right. Okay. Consequences of Red Cloud's War. Now, one of these, I wasn't sure whether to put, but actually it does make sense. The biggest consequence of Red Cloud's War is this here. This one here. The Second Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868. So, the Second Fort Laramie Treaty was signed in 1868, and what it did was, it closed the Bozeman Trail, that trail that people walked on, meaning settlers could not go through Indians' land, although by this time a new trail had been found, so it really didn't matter. In return for closing the Bozeman Trail, Red Cloud agreed to move into a newly created reservation, the Great Sioux Reservation. This would be exclusively for the Sioux and would allow them to live in peace. No white settlers were allowed into the reservation. That's going to be very positive. You can explain why that would help them live their life and develop that a bit further. You could argue that the Second Fort Laramie Treaty led to further conflict, as some Sioux did not agree with it. However, Red Cloud agreed, and he went on and lived a life very much of peace after agreeing to the Second Fort Laramie Treaty. The next one is very difficult. Now, this is something we've been through in a previous lesson, President Grant's peace policy. Now, President Grant's peace policy was a way to stop, a way to basically help the reservation system get better, to stop the conflict. Now, President Grant didn't want to exterminate the Indians. He wanted a peace policy that aimed to end the conflict between white Americans and Plains Indians. And you could argue that to a degree, this was as a result of the fighting. This was as a result of the years of conflict that had occurred. And he realised that actually a lot of this conflict was down to two things: breaking the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1851, and also the fact that the reservation system was so poor. So he realised that bad management of reservations was causing conflict and making it harder to convince the free Indians to move onto a reservation. So he did a few things. We've done this in a previous lesson. He appointed new Indian agents to run the reservations who were religious. He believed these would be more likely to treat the Indians well. They were Quakers, who actually are very strongly religious and believe in no man's suffering. Now, he also wanted them to convert the Indians to Christianity and teach them to live like white Americans. So there was an agenda behind this. He also appointed an Indian called Eli Parker as the Commissioner of Indian Affairs. So sort of the man who was in charge of looking after the Indians' well-being, etc. And there was a $2 million budget to improve the lives on reservations. The army were ordered to protect the Indians from outside and also prevent war parties, so the warriors, dog soldiers, the warrior brotherhoods, from leaving the reservations. And it would be very hostile. If they did leave, it could lead to death. So there was some good and bad parts of this peace policy, absolutely, but this was a consequence of the wars. But the problems. Some members of his own government were so corrupt that money actually never got to the reservation. So some of the money that he promised never got to the reservations. Many Indians didn't want to leave their lifestyle behind. The Indian Appropriation Act was a major problem and undermined his policy. Now, the Indian Appropriation Act came as a result of Eli Parker. Eli Parker stated that Native Americans shouldn't be trusted, shouldn't be treated differently to everyone else. So it stopped treaties being agreed between Native Americans and the government. The Native Americans were to be treated like everyone else. It stopped treating tribes and independent nations. Instead, it treated them as individuals. It treated them the same as everyone else. And the key thing here is it meant the government no longer had to stick to any previous agreement. If anything, the Indian Appropriation Act of 1871 made it easier to take land off the Native Americans. So, the next task is a bit of exam practice. So using this, I'd like you to answer this question. Explain 2 consequences of Red Cloud's War. Okay. Now, you can talk about the Second Fort Laramie Treaty. You can talk about the impact that had. You can talk about Grant's peace policy and the impact that had. The key thing with this is number 1, you give a consequence. One consequence of Red Cloud's War was. Then you support it with 4 to 5 lines of specific evidence. This led to. What did it lead to? What happened because of it? This question can be quite simple, as long as you understand, and I've said this in previous lessons, that a consequence can be good, bad, long-term, short-term. And it can be a consequence on the Indians, the government, the settlers. It can be a consequence on any group, okay? Like I told you in lesson in the past, think about consequences if you weren't to wear your school uniform. Who would that have a consequence on? What would it have a consequence because of? What would it lead to? Would it just be that day or would it be longer? That sort of stuff. So as a summary of these last 2 lessons, we have gone through the 3 key wars. You must have an understanding of these wars and really go deep into the concept that this was the beginning of the end for the Native Americans. Out of the 3 wars, you'd argue that they were successful in one of them, slightly, Red Cloud's War, but the other 2 were dramatic failures and it led to worse conditions in the long run. So the key thing is you understand the cause of the war, the narrative, the events of the war, and then what happened because of these wars as time went on.